Today we're learning about the unit circle. We've already kind of discussed this a little bit. We just didn't lay it all out. You will need to know the unit circle, especially for the next unit we will be starting next week. You know we start here at 0 degrees. You guys know up here is 90. Halfway across the circle is 180 degrees. Add another 90 to get 270 here. And all the way around the circle is 360 degrees. Okay, there's some special angles that we look at. You guys know that halfway between 0 and 90 right here would be 45. Okay, so if that's halfway is 45, 45 plus 45 is 90. If we go halfway between 90 and 180, that would be 45 more, which would give us 135 degrees. Halfway between 180 and 270, so 45 plus 180 would give us 225 degrees. And halfway between 270 and 360, again, we'd add 45 degrees to get 315 degrees. It's hard to write sideways, sorry. Okay, another angle that we've been looking at a lot are our 30-degree angles. So from 0, rotating 30 degrees, we'd have 30 degrees here. We add another 30 degrees, that would give us 60 degrees. If we add another 30 degrees, we get 90. If we go another 30 degrees, 90 plus 30 is 120. If we add another 30 degrees, then 120 plus 30 is 150. If we add another 30 degrees, then 150 plus 30 is 180, and 180 plus 30 is 210. 210 plus 30 is 240, and 240 plus 30 is 270. 270 plus 30 is 300, and 300 plus 30 degrees would give us 330. So these are just some special angles that we need to know. We know that when we're at 0 degrees, we have 0 radians. We know all the way around the circle are 2 pi radians. So if all the way around is 2 pi, then halfway around would just give us pi radians. From 0 radians to pi radians, halfway would be pi over 2 radians. Okay, and halfway between 0 and pi over 2, so half of a half is a fourth. So this is pi over 4. So if we rotate this way, that's 1 pi over 4. This would give us 2 pi over 4. And 2 pi over 4 is equal to pi halves. So 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4. We rotate another 45 degrees, and we would get 3 pi over 4. So again, that's 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, and then if we rotate again, we get 4 pi over 4, and 4 pi over 4 is just pi. If we rotate another 45 degrees, that would be 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4. And if we rotate another 45, that would give us 6 pi over 4. And 6 pi over 4 is actually 3 pi over 2. So again, 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4, 6 pi over 4. So this would be 7 pi over 4. And then if we went 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4, 6 pi over 4, 7 pi over 4, this would be 8 pi over 4, which is equal to 2 pi. Okay, we could also, every 30 degrees in radians is pi over 6, okay? So this would be 1 pi over 6. And if we rotate another 30 degrees, we'd get 2 pi over 6. And 2 pi over 6 is just equal to pi over 3. So 1 pi over 6, 2 pi over 6, which is pi over 3. This would be 3 pi over 6, and 3 pi over 6 is pi over 2. We're just checking, okay? So 1 pi over 6, 2 pi over 6, 3 pi over 6. This would be 4 pi over 6. And what is 4 pi over 6 equal to? That would be 2 pi over 3. Okay? So 1 pi over 6, 2 pi over 6, 3 pi over 6, 4 pi over 6. So this would be 5 pi over 6. And then we would get to 6 pi over 6, which 6 pi over 6 is just pi. So 1 pi over 6, 2 pi over 6, 3 pi over 6, 4 pi over 6, 5 pi over 6, 6 pi over 6. That would lead us to 7 pi over 6. If we rotate another 30 degrees, that takes us to 8 pi over 6. And 8 pi over 6 is equal to 4 pi over 3. Okay, so 1 pi over 6, 2 pi over 6, 3 pi over 6, 4 pi over 6, 5 pi over 6, 6 pi over 6, 7 pi over 6, 8 pi over 6, 9 pi over 6, and 9 pi over 6 is 3 pi over 2. So this was 9 pi over 6. Another 30 degrees would be 10 pi over 6. And 10 pi over 6 is 5 pi over 3. And then 11 pi over 6. And then this would be 12 pi over 6. And 12 pi over 6 is just 2 pi. That's all I'm going to have for you guys today. So my suggestion for you for homework, for practice, is just practice. You should be able to know how to list all the angles as well as all the radians for the unit circles. So, you know, watch the video again, just practice doing it. Print out a blank sheet, and you don't have to have a printed out unit circle if you don't have a printer at home. You can just draw a blank circle and list it on your own. You know that the important ones are the 45 degrees, the 30, and the 60. Again, you'll have it right here in the middle, 45 degrees, 30, and then your 60. 45 degrees, 30, and your 60. 45 degrees, 30, and your 60. So then you could just start and say 0, 30, 45, 60, 90, 120, 135, 150, 180, 210, 225, 240, 270, 300, 315, 330, and 360. And then if you were to do your radians next, that would be 0 radians. We can start this way: pi over 2 radians, pi radians, 3 pi over 2 radians. This would be pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 3. And from then you can finish doing your radians. So that's what I want you guys to work on for your homework.